All right, here we go. Welcome into the 49ers Report by Chat Sports. Chase Senior here with you. Here's what we have coming your way on today's show. An investigation, as I go back to my roots as a journalist. Who is the higher-ranking executive who leaked that Trey Lance suffers from arm fatigue? And is it going to be somebody who's leading the charge in this front office? So the detective resume, that is me, yours truly. I studied hard-hitting journalism at Temple University, so I'm well-equipped to really do deep diving research into all of this. I'm an ex-news reporter coming to Chat Sports from WNEP in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I was a former neighborhood watchdog. Now, me personally, I like covering sports. I like talking about football in San Francisco more so than covering local news, but I have experience here, and that's why I am the detective for today's exercise. So we first take a look at their paper trail, which will then lead us to some suspects in this investigation. So you look at the timeline here of where this Trey Lance arm fatigue and arm fitness conversation started. It began with former offensive lineman Ryan Harris, who back in May on CBS Sports HQ said that he has been hearing that Trey Lance suffers from arm fitness. Then back last week, Colin Cowherd and Mike Silver did a podcast on the Volume Podcast Network, and once again, they had said, according to sources, that Trey Lance had to sit out practices because he too suffers from arm fatigue. Matt Mayoko running it back, backing up what Silver had to say and said, yeah, me and Jennifer Lee Chan on NBC Sports Bay Area talked about this several months ago, and according to a high-ranking 49ers executive, it is a thing. The leak coming from a high-ranking executive, so who is it? We'll do our best to provide you with an answer coming up right around the corner. But first, here's what Ryan Harris had to say back in May, because the context here in this investigation is very, very important. From players I've talked to and coaches I've talked to who are at the 49ers, Trey Lance is really leaving a lot to be desired in terms of the fitness of his arm, whether or not he can digest the playbook and can really start to process the game at a high level. Now, at that time, it was a rumor that we discussed because we were like, okay, fitness of the arm and arm soreness is something that we hear about from baseball pitchers, but for a quarterback, what exactly does it mean? Ryan Harris tweeted this out after he had said that and said, arm fitness, it's like the Webster's Dictionary here. The ability to consistently throw the football all season long and beyond to the playoffs. This can be fixed through focused offseason training and a commitment to arm care. As for what Cowherd and Silver said last week on their podcast together, Cowherd first, then Silver, the 49ers are rebuilding his delivery, and he gets arm fatigue. It's not an easy throwing motion. He needs days off, and they're worried about his accuracy. Silver responded by saying, yeah, I'm hearing this from a similar source. It sounds like we have the same source. The arm fatigue is a really interesting thing, and I have heard that too. Now, this investigation is only getting started by Detective Chase, but first, I want to hear from you in the comment section. Do you find this to be concerning? Do you think that it's all baloney? Let me know in the comment section right now. Let your voices be heard. T for troublesome, type B for baloney. Now, we got to make some connections here, right? Because we've heard this from Ryan Harris, who won a Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos back several years ago. He's the former offensive lineman who we just talked about. Then there was the conversation between Colin Cowherd and Mike Silver, and everybody took to the Twitter streets, and they were bashing Cowherd and Silver. But Matt Mayoko, who's arguably the most well-respected 49ers reporter for NBC Sports Bay Area, said, yeah, this is a thing, and we covered this back several months ago, so Silver's reporting, it is technically true, and it's not factually false. So for it to come from Matt Mayoko, that's when people started to turn their heads a little bit. Now, this investigation continues, and it furthers on by us making a connection as to who the high-ranking executive might be. And their paper trail leads to John Lynch, the general manager. And if that's the case, that's a really big problem. But here are the connections here. Harris played with John Lynch. They won a Super Bowl together with the Denver Broncos back several years ago at the tail end of Lynch's playing career. Colin Cowherd worked with John Lynch at Fox Sports. Mike Silver is a well-respected NFL reporter who's a Bay Area guy. He's good friends with Steve Kerr. He's been around the 49ers organization. He went to Cal, so he knows the area and San Francisco really well. And Matt Maiocco, as we know, does a podcast for NBC Sports Bay Area with John Lynch. He's very close with him, at least he appears to be, and Lynch has no problem with giving Maiocco scoops from time to time. So with that, I ask you this. Who is the leaker, and is it John Lynch? If that's the case, then there are some problems here that we have to talk about. Give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Now, if you're watching us live on Callin, we're going live, or if you're watching us live on YouTube for our YouTube and Rumble show, we're going live on Callin for a live podcast after our Tuesday show. If you're watching this after the fact, we go live on the 49ers Report every single Tuesday, and after that, we do a live podcast on Callin, which is like Twitter Spaces, but even better, where you have an opportunity to call into the show. Make sure you subscribe, download the app, and join me. It's chatsports.com/49ers Callin. Every single Tuesday, we go live at 6 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Pacific. Now, John Lynch is where the paper trail leads to, but there are some other suspects that we have to talk about during the course of this investigation. And, you know, in the first 48, throughout the course of a investigation, you have to have other suspects. You can't just pinpoint one person. And honestly, is it realistic that John Lynch is the leaker? Is he just a Jimmy Garoppolo guy? He doesn't like Lance? I don't know, because he moved up to take Trey Lance in the draft. So that's why I find it hard to believe that it is Lynch, but that's where the paper trail leads us. It could be a front office member who loves Jimmy Garoppolo. It could honestly be Don Yee as well, but for Maiocco to say it's a front office executive with San Francisco, then that would take Don Yee out of the equation. I do think Don, in order to increase the value of Garoppolo on the trade market, is giving some information to media sources out there. But Cowherd, Silver, Maiocco, Ryan Harris, all of them have ties to a certain degree to John Lynch. What's also interesting here is that the coaching staff has never heard of this. And Ted Wynn of The Athletic, one of the most respected film evaluators in the National Football League, had tweeted this out after Silver had reported this on that podcast with Cowherd. Asked a member of the 49ers coaching staff about Trey Lance's, quote, arm fatigue. His response, I've never heard anything about that in a day in my life. So you have the coaching staff who they have their hands on Trey Lance, and they coach him every single day. They evaluate the tape. They've never heard about this arm fatigue, but somebody in the front office is talking about it. Could that front office executive be a Jimmy G. Homer and a guy who didn't agree with the choice to move up to take Lance? That's another aspect of this investigation. As for my take, I said this last week when we talked about this. I think all of this stems from last year because Lance does have somewhat of a clunky motion, or at least he did last year, and he's trying to clean it up to a certain degree. Throughout OTAs and minicamp, it looked a little bit tighter and a little bit more smooth. But altering your mechanics can lead to arm soreness. If a pitcher is throwing an over-the-top delivery and then they switch to three-quarters or even a sidearm delivery, that's going to put stress on the elbow. It's going to put stress on the shoulder. And the same thing can be said for a quarterback, right? If you're winding up one way or if your release point is at one spot as compared to another spot, and you've been throwing that way for years, maybe even your entire life, then if you switch that up, you're going to have some arm soreness, and you might need to take a day off because the last thing you want to do is have to get Tommy John surgery or some type of surgery on your arm, whether it be your elbow or your shoulder. So I think a lot of this stems from last year because throughout OTAs and minicamp, it was said that Lance looked good. He was throwing the football with some gusto and mustard. He was pretty accurate as compared to last year. You also have to factor in the finger injury that he suffered from last year, which he said messed with his mechanics and did impact his accuracy to a certain degree. Now, here's another thing. Nobody has reported on Lance missing practice. Maiocco, any of the other reporters who were actually on hand to watch these practices, and that's where I kind of have a problem throughout the course of this, right? Since Lance became a Niner. There's the national media with this narrative that he can't play, that he's a bust, that he doesn't look good at practices, when they're never on hand to actually watch him. Whereas the reporters who are on the sideline watching Lance play have said he's made some improvements, he has a lot of potential, and he's looked really good. And nobody's reported on the fact that Lance is missing practice because of quote-unquote arm fatigue. So something doesn't add up in the course of this investigation. Going back to John Lynch, though, if it's John Lynch who is leaking this information to some really credible and noteworthy media members and reporters, Cowherd has the most listened to radio show in the United States, and then Mike Silver has a really large following, and then Matt Maiocco is basically the face of 49ers media when it comes to journalistic standards. That's a big problem. If the general manager is the one who's giving this information out to a couple of different sources, because you know they're going to talk about it on their respective mediums. Podcast, radio show for Cowherd, and then Mike Silver can write about this, and then Matt Maiocco on NBC Sports Bay Area on the written and audio side. Why bring on drama that does you no good as a franchise, and why put added pressure on Trey Lance? I can imagine he's watching all of this unfold. He's watching everything that everybody is saying about him, and he's like, what's going on here? This is weird. My arm feels fine. So with all of that, we're going to round out this investigatory show by asking you to give me your feedback on how I did. Grade my detective work, A, B, C, D, or F. Let me know right now in the comment section. Having some fun, but giving you some really important analysis.